Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we are stepping into the mind of a giant. We are looking at the work of a man who didn't just observe the business world. In many ways, he created it. I'm talking, of course, about Peter F. Drucker. The book we are unpacking today is Classic Drucker, a collection that encapsulates the enduring principles of management that have shaped the modern world. Now, before we dive into the specific strategies, I want you to pause and consider something. 50 or 60 years ago, the word management was barely in the dictionary. It was a vague term, often synonymous with the boss or rank. It wasn't seen as a discipline, a science, or a liberal art. It was Peter Drucker who changed that. He looked at the industrial world and saw that without structure, without objectives, and without a deep understanding of human potential, organizations were doomed to inefficiency. He famously said that 40 years ago, talking about management was considered crazy. Today, it is the air we breathe. But as we will see, the air has changed, and Drucker saw that coming too. What makes Drucker so fascinating is that he didn't just write for the CEO in the corner office. He wrote for the individual. And that is where we are going to start today, not with the corporation, but with you. The first major theme we encounter in this collection is the concept of managing oneself. We live in an age of unprecedented opportunity. If you have ambition and intelligence, you can rise to the top of your chosen profession, regardless of where you started. But with this opportunity comes a heavy burden, responsibility. Companies today do not manage their employees' careers. The days of joining a firm at 20 and retiring at 65 with a gold watch and a pension are largely gone. Today, you must be your own chief executive officer. Drucker argues that to manage oneself, you have to answer some fundamental, almost uncomfortable questions. The first is, what are my strengths? It sounds simple, doesn't it? But Drucker points out that most people are terrible at knowing their strengths. We are much better at identifying our weaknesses. But here is the kicker: you cannot build performance on weaknesses. You can only build on strengths. Drucker suggests a technique called feedback analysis. Whenever you make a key decision or take a key action, write down what you expect will happen. 9 or 12 months later, compare the actual results with your expectations. If you do this consistently, you will see a pattern. You will see where your strengths lie, and just as importantly, you will see where your intellectual arrogance is causing you to fail. Once you know your strengths, you have to understand how you perform. This is a subtle but critical distinction. Drucker asks, are you a reader or a listener? It's a binary question that explains so much failure in leadership. He gives the example of Dwight Eisenhower. When Eisenhower was supreme commander in Europe, he was the darling of the press. His press conferences were brilliant. Why? Because questions were submitted in writing beforehand. Eisenhower was a reader. He read the question, formulated the answer, and delivered it. But when he became president, he faced open press conferences. He had to listen to questions on the fly. And he rambled. He wasn't a listener, he was a reader. He tried to work in a way that didn't fit his nature, and he suffered for it. Knowing whether you process information by reading or listening, whether you work better alone or in a pack, whether you perform better as a decision maker or an advisor, these are the keys to managing yourself. This leads us naturally to the next great pillar of Drucker's philosophy, which moves from the individual to the organization. He calls it the theory of the business. Why do great companies fail? Why did General Motors, which dominated the automotive world for decades, suddenly find itself struggling? Why did IBM, the colossus of computing, hit a wall? Drucker argues that it wasn't because they became lazy or stupid. It was because the assumptions they built their business on, their theory of the business, no longer fit reality. Every organization operates on a set of assumptions. Assumptions about what the market is, who the customer is, what the customer values, and what technology is available. When a company is successful, these assumptions become gospel. They become the way things are done. But the world changes. Markets shift. Technologies evolve. And if the theory doesn't change with them, the business collapses. Let's look at IBM. In the early days, IBM was brilliant at shifting gears. They moved from tabulating machines to mainframes with incredible agility. They built a theory that the computer was a piece of hardware that companies bought to do heavy calculations. But then, the personal computer arrived. The PC challenged the very definition of a computer. It wasn't just a smaller mainframe, it was a tool for individual productivity. IBM tried to fit the PC into their old theory, treating it as a peripheral business. They didn't realize that the theory of the business had fundamentally shifted from hardware to software and connectivity. They nearly missed the boat because their theory had become a dogma. Drucker teaches us that these assumptions must be tested constantly. We have to ask, if we weren't already in this business, would we enter it today? If the answer is no, then you are in trouble. This brings us to the concept of organized abandonment. It is painful, but essential. You must be willing to abandon the products, services, and policies that no longer fit the new reality. Even if, especially if, they were your biggest successes in the past. Now, let's navigate to the mechanism of how organizations actually function, decision-making. Drucker's take on this is counterintuitive. We tend to think that effective executives make a lot of decisions. Drucker says the opposite. Effective executives make very few decisions. But the decisions they do make are the big ones, the systematic ones. He breaks this down into a fascinating process. The first step is classification. Is this a generic problem or an exceptional one? Most problems are generic. They are symptoms of a structural issue. If you treat a generic problem as a unique event, you are just applying a band-aid. You are fighting fires instead of fireproofing the building. Drucker points to the failure of the Kennedy administration's policies as an example of treating structural problems as a series of unique crises. In contrast, effective decision-makers look for the underlying pattern. They try to establish a rule or a principle that solves the generic problem once and for all. Then, you have to define the boundary conditions. What does the decision have to satisfy? What are the minimum goals? If a decision doesn't satisfy the boundary conditions, it's not a decision, it's a wish. And perhaps the most practical advice he gives here is about compromise. He says you have to start with what is right, not what is acceptable. If you start by worrying about what people will accept, you will inevitably compromise away the effectiveness of the decision. You'll end up with a decision that pleases everyone but solves nothing. Start with the ideal solution. You will have to compromise eventually, but if you don't know what right looks like, you won't know the difference between the right compromise and the wrong one. This rigorous thinking is necessary because the workforce itself has changed. This brings us to one of Drucker's most prophetic contributions, the rise of the knowledge worker. For most of history, productivity was about manual labor. How fast can you shovel coal? How fast can you assemble a widget? Frederick Taylor revolutionized this in the late 19th century with scientific management. But today, the most valuable asset of a 21st century institution is not its production equipment, but its knowledge workers and their productivity. Here is the challenge. You cannot manage knowledge workers in the traditional sense. You cannot stand over a programmer or a surgeon and say, "Work faster." You don't know what they are thinking. You don't know if they are solving a problem or daydreaming. They own the means of production, their brains. This shifts the power dynamic entirely. In the past, the company owned the factory, so the company held the power. Today, the knowledge worker can pack up their means of production and walk out the door to a competitor. Drucker argues that we must treat these employees not as subordinates, but as volunteers. Think about that for a second. Volunteers. Why do volunteers work? Not for a paycheck, but for a mission. They work because they believe in the cause. They want to make a contribution. Therefore, the job of the modern manager is to market the job to the employee. You have to sell them on the mission. You have to align their personal values with the organization's goals. If you treat them like factory hands, you will lose them. They need autonomy. They need to know that their work matters. This is why Drucker says that in the knowledge society, we don't manage people, we lead them. And what are we leading them toward? Innovation. Drucker demystifies innovation. We tend to think of innovation as a flash of genius, the apple falling on Newton's head. Drucker says, no, innovation is a discipline. It is work. It can be organized. It can be learned. He outlines several sources of innovation, but the most interesting one is the unexpected. Most managers hate the unexpected. They hate it when sales reports don't match the forecasts. If a product that wasn't supposed to sell suddenly takes off, the typical corporate reaction is to say, that's a mistake. Or that customer is using it wrong. Drucker says this is madness. The unexpected success is the single greatest opportunity for innovation. It tells you that the market has shifted. It tells you that there is a value you didn't perceive. He tells the story of how IBM became a leader. In the 1930s, they built a machine for banks. Banks didn't buy it. But the New York Public Library did. They wanted it for cataloging. IBM could have said, we don't serve libraries. Instead, they followed the unexpected success, which eventually led them to the root of the computer age. Innovation is about looking at the incongruities, the gap between what is supposed to happen and what actually happens, and asking why. Now, let's bring all these threads together into the structure of the organization itself. Drucker envisioned the information-based organization. For a long time, companies were modeled after the military, command and control. Layers and layers of middle management whose only job was to take orders from the top and push them down to the bottom. But in an era of information and knowledge workers, this structure is too slow. It distorts information. Drucker uses the analogy of a symphony orchestra. In an orchestra, you have hundreds of musicians, highly skilled specialists, and one conductor. You don't have a VP of brass or a director of strings standing between the conductor and the violinists. The conductor communicates directly with the specialists. Everyone plays from the same sheet music. That is the strategy, the mission. This flat structure requires immense self-discipline. Each musician must know their part perfectly. They must listen to the others. They must take responsibility for their performance. In the information-based organization, everyone must ask, what information do I need to do my job? And who needs the information that I produce? When you strip away the layers of management, communication becomes the lifeblood of the company. If you hoard information, the orchestra falls apart. But let's not forget the core purpose of all this. It's not just to be efficient, it's to be effective. Drucker makes a crucial distinction between the two. Efficiency is doing things right. Effectiveness is doing the right things. You can be incredibly efficient at making a product that no one wants. That is the ultimate waste. The manager's job is to focus resources on opportunities, not problems. He noticed a tendency in managers to put their best people on their biggest problems. We have a crisis in the South American division. Send our best manager. Drucker says this is wrong. You should put your best people on your biggest opportunities. Problems, at best, restore normality. Opportunities produce results. If you starve your opportunities to feed your problems, you are managing for mediocrity. This requires a shift in mindset, a willingness to practice organized abandonment of the old to make room for the new. As we move toward the conclusion of this exploration, we have to look at the broader society. Drucker saw the emergence of a society of organizations. We live in a world where almost every social task is performed by a large organization: businesses, hospitals, universities, government agencies. This creates a new social tension. These organizations have power. They have social power. Therefore, they must have social responsibility. However, Drucker warns against a misunderstanding of social responsibility. A business is not a charity. Its first social responsibility is to be profitable. If it doesn't cover its costs of capital, it is destroying society's wealth. It is wasting resources. Only a profitable business can hire people, pay taxes, and innovate. But beyond that, the organization must ensure that its impact on the community is positive. It must manage its power so that it doesn't trample on the freedom of the individual. This balance between the autonomy of the organization and the good of the commonweal is the defining political challenge of our time. So, what is the takeaway for us? Whether you are a freelancer, a mid-level manager, or a CEO, Drucker's message is clear. You are responsible. You are responsible for knowing yourself, your strengths, your values, your methods. You are responsible for your own communication, making sure you are understood. You are responsible for focusing on contribution, looking outward to what the situation requires, not just inward at what you want to do. Management, in Drucker's eyes, is not just about spreadsheets and bottom lines. It is a liberal art. It deals with people, their values, their growth, and their development. It is about making human strength productive and human weakness irrelevant. That is a profound definition. It elevates the daily grind of business into a noble pursuit. It reminds us that at the center of every spreadsheet, every strategy meeting, every product launch, there are human beings trying to achieve something together that they could not achieve alone. As you go about your work this week, ask yourself the Drucker questions: what is the theory of my business, or my career, and is it still valid? Am I feeding problems or starving opportunities? And most importantly, what can I contribute that will significantly affect the performance and the results of the institution I serve? The answers might just change everything. Thank you for listening.